Hi folks, I'm Wyatt Parks at Sharing Our Roots Farm here in Northfield, Minnesota. If this is your first time joining us online or in person, then welcome to our farm. We're a 100-acre research and demonstration farm with a focus on perennial agriculture, but we also have some annual veggie production, botanicals, chickens, sheep, goats, and cows all on site. We have elderberries, hazelnuts, pastures, fruit trees, hardwoods, and a bunch of other assorted plantings across the farm that we cultivate, harvest, sell, and distribute. We also provide space for individuals from our community to engage in farming as volunteers, land stewards, and farmers. Our team engages in outreach work that is connecting folks to community gardens and other food-related services in our area. Our mission is to advance a resilient agricultural system that demonstrates the power to heal our lands, nourish our communities, and prepare aspiring farmers. And today we want to focus on our chickens here at the farm, and specifically our grant project titled Evaluating Hazelnuts as a Soy Protein Replacement in Free-Range Poultry Systems. Funding for this project was provided by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's AGRI Sustainable Demonstration Grant Program. Our project is summarized as testing the viability of feeding hazelnuts and hazelnut processing byproducts to chickens within our poultry production method as a substitute for soy-based protein. We want to know if the hazelnuts can provide usable protein in high enough density to maintain the growth and vigor of the birds. We are also exploring the economic potential of feeding waste hazelnuts, those that are small or non-retail quality, to poultry, and whether hazelnuts as a feed can be price competitive with soy meal, or if the chickens can command a higher retail price due to quality. We are aware of some research that was performed feeding hazelnut meal to Cornish cross chickens in confinement, but none that centered on free-range type systems utilizing less conventional breeds. For this research, we used Freedom Ranger, a dual-purpose bird that ranges well and produces a quality meat in a reasonable time on a traditional non-GMO diet. We wanted to identify a few key levers to success or failures for farmers looking to expand their feed options for chickens. What we've come away with as the key questions are: will the birds eat the hazelnuts in the first place? Do they continue to gain weight and body condition that is comparable to conventionally fed counterparts? And is it economical to feed hazelnuts to chickens? We designed the research initially to take place over 2 years, but due to COVID and various staffing changes, we had to compress all of our field trials into the summer of 2021. Our original proposal had us testing 2 different types of hazelnut products. The first was a hazelnut meal that is a byproduct of the oil pressing process. This meal is the same product that is generally made into hazelnut flour for human consumption and can either be left as a pellet straight from the press or milled into a fine flour. We attempted to source both in hopes that we could test the palatability of each and discovered a major barrier. After a variety of attempts to source meal, we came to the conclusion that unless a farmer is interested in having on-farm oil pressing capacity where meal would be available to them, they would be much better served in working towards producing a food-grade product and avoiding the livestock feed entirely. In the current market, the meal product is just too valuable as a human food product for domestic processors to be interested in selling into livestock feed markets without suitable compensation. And the cost difference is pretty stark when you see hazelnut flour retailing for about $15 a pound and soybean meal selling for roughly $36 a pound at the local elevator at the time of this grant. The second hazelnut product we worked to source was a coarse milled whole kernel product. Ideally, we wanted both with shell and without, again to test the palatability for our chickens. Because we do not have any deshelling equipment on farm, we were forced to look for custom deshelling from one of the few processors with the needed equipment. And the long and short is we either got no response or limited enthusiasm for custom processing. My understanding is that the American hybrid hazelnut, what we have available locally and what we grow on our own farm, are still very much in their infancy as a commercial product, and as such are a pain to process at scale. They lack consistent shell size, they need to be dehulled, and the equipment being used in our region is all custom made and still being refined. The cost to have our hazelnuts deshelled and coarsely milled was likely to be an issue even if we could find a processor. With all these barriers in mind, we went back to the drawing board and tried to think what is realistic for farmers. And the situation we envisioned most farmers being in was that they have a buyer for whole in-shell raw nuts, and the farmer has dehulling and sizing equipment on site, but not much else. This level of processing is generally where food safety regulations start to get involved, so farmers wanting to increase the value of their product without getting bogged down by expensive equipment or regulations are likely to stop here. And what they would be left with regularly as a byproduct is small, split, and otherwise not food-grade nuts. And these have little to no market value and are a waste product for most operations. Adding the waste to a compost pile would be great for organic matter, but for folks who don't have a managed pile, it is going to take a really long time to decompose. Feeding the waste to hogs is probably the most recognized alternative, considering the value of mass-fed pork. No extra processing of the nuts would be required, but you have to have hogs, something that many small farmers choose to avoid. Chickens are a much more ubiquitous livestock option and are demonstrated to be able to eat hazelnuts when processed correctly. In our quest to evaluate hazelnuts as feed, we started looking at our options for processing on farm. We had sourced 1,800 pounds of whole in-shell hazelnuts that were partially dehulled from a local farmer and started experimenting. We started with a small bench-mounted mill in hopes that would illuminate some options for processing, and quickly realized that was not even a remotely feasible option. The shells were simply too hard for the non-commercial grade equipment and would jam up the mill. We were using it in a hand crank mode, and working out the motor size to run it off electricity indicated that we would need an unreasonably large motor to generate the force needed to smash the shell and break up the kernel with that type of mill. The next iteration involved a large jump in capacity, but also expense. Moving from the benchtop mill, we went straight to a PTO-driven wood chipper behind one of our tractors. The design of this chipper in particular has a large rotating flywheel with a cutting edge that is close enough to the intake chute that most of the material entering the machine has to come in contact with that cutting edge. The result of this is that small material like hazelnuts, which would normally be able to pass through untouched, take the full force of the flywheel. Granted, some still pass through untouched, and a single pass doesn't break down the material enough for chickens. We found 2 to 3 passes through the chipper resulted in material that was roughly equivalent in size to the largest pieces of corn and soybean in the conventional feed. Knowing that we were able to create a feed material that was generally suitable for chickens did not address the fact that it was not reasonable for farmers to invest the needed time in processing. On average, it took roughly 15 to 20 minutes to process 25 to 30 pounds of hazelnuts in this way, and needed to be done every few days to prevent spoilage. Now, we do not currently have the tractor that can be dedicated solely to running the chipper, so it needed to be cleaned and stored after each use. The chipper needed to be unhooked from the tractor and stowed under cover. Farmers also chronically undervalue their time, so I want to be clear in saying that for something like this, you have to assume a value of $15 to $20 per hour, like you are paying an employee. The reason it is important to value the time is because the hazelnut processing alone can cost an extra 50 cents per pound. This is also only enough hazelnuts for 300 to 400 chickens. That is an extra $900 of labor expense. Most consumers are not excited about paying $12 more per chicken simply for hazelnut-fed poultry, a market item that doesn't have the same allure as mass-fed pork. Of that $12 increase, roughly $10 is represented in the hazelnuts themselves, and another $2 per pound is the labor expense. An additional expense can also be attributed to the increased labor of mixing the processed hazelnuts into the feed ration, something that is done by the elevator when ordering bulk feed, but has to be done by hand in the system. The expense of the tractor, fuel, and chipper are also not accounted for in this increased expense breakdown. Our small tractor can easily burn 4 gallons of diesel an hour at PTO speed, adding another $120 to $150 of expense. We paid roughly $10,000 for the tractor and $3,000 for the chipper. All told, the expense of processing hazelnuts is difficult to fully quantify, but from personal experience, it was neither easy nor cheap. Before we had ever even fed a chicken, the cost of feeding hazelnuts was economically infeasible in our situation. The key levers in our case was the purchase of hazelnuts and the labor to process them. For farms who already have a ready source of free hazelnuts, the margin is much more reasonable to pass to consumers, especially if you have buyers who are insistent on soy-free fed. Now, those farms that would have to buy in hazelnuts are going to see a sharp increase in feed expense that I don't believe can be effectively passed to the consumer and expect to retain customers. And having identified the cost as an issue, we started working on actually feeding the hazelnuts to our chickens. We kept both the control group and trial groups on a traditional feed for the first 4 weeks of life. Our bulk feed supplier mills a starting feed that has both corn and soy, as well as a specific mineral mix for developing chicks. For farmers looking to be completely soy-free, the starter mix will not work, and I hesitate to suggest that hazelnut products can be a substitute for the readily available protein for such young animals. In this case, we did not want to alter the known successful diet too early and create stunting issues that would persist regardless of future feed composition. When we partitioned our coop to separate our trial and control groups, we noticed a strong behavioral change in our chickens. Birds were actively trying to get to feeders outside of their group, a behavior we had not expected. We weren't sure how much of this was feed type driven and how much of it was feeding order related. Our birds are kept inside a barn at night with no feed available, so when they first exit the barn, they tend to head straight to the nearest feeder. If our feed amounts were slightly off from the day before, some of the feeders would be entirely empty first thing in the morning before we had fed for the day. Traditionally, there would be a significant amount of alternative feeders for the chickens to visit, but because each group had only a dozen feeders available, the likelihood of them encountering multiple empty feeders was higher. I estimate on average 10 to 20 birds would escape their field and move to and from all three groups each day from week 4 to 6. By the time the birds were fully developed, they had adjusted to the routine and had a harder time slipping through the small gaps or climbing and flying over the fence. This certainly affected the group weights throughout the flock's duration, but I can't identify a clear percentage as it was nearly impossible to identify specific individuals and evaluate the number of unique crossings. Initially, we had attempted to feed the hazelnuts on their own in a separate feeder right by the doors to the coop. The thought being the close proximity to the doors would encourage the most aggressive feeders to eat hazelnuts first and then move to the mixed feed. Chickens tend to follow by example, so if a few birds started feeding at the hazelnuts, more would likely follow. In the first few weeks of feed placement, I observed only a handful of birds pecking at the hazelnuts, and based on the amount left at the end of each day, few other birds were joining in. As a whole, the flock generally ignored the hazelnuts. The next attempt to encourage feeding was to mix a small portion of the ground feed in with the hazelnuts. When the chicks are young, they're fed in trays set on the ground, so the thought was adding ground feed would get them started at the hazelnuts, and they would inevitably eat some of the nuts and gain the experience to know that they're food. While more chickens paused at the feeders with hazelnuts and pecked at them, few stayed for any significant amount of time when other feed was available. And generally, we worked to avoid situations where feed was limited, as it has been well documented that free choice feed is key to good growth in chickens. Attempting to force the chickens to eat hazelnuts by making it the only feed available would not have been effective based on our observations. The only chickens that tended to linger near the hazelnut feeders were the small and sickly birds that tended to not stray far from the coop. These birds were regularly forced out from feeding at the main feeders, so they tended to look for less competitive feed sources. In this case, that was the hazelnut feeders. More birds would also linger near the hazelnuts when other feed was not available, though they didn't appear to be eating much from the feeders. Generally, when feed was not easily available, birds would transition to foraging or return to the coop to rest until more feed was available. The only success in feeding hazelnuts came when we began to mix the hazelnuts with our sprouted grain mix. Our mix includes a variety of different grains depending on availability and price, but almost always includes wheat, sorghum, oats, sunflowers, and buckwheat. The grain is mixed together and soaked for 24 hours in water with vinegar added. This mix is then broadcast around the paddock each day during feeding for the chickens to forage for. In previous flocks, there was always a mix of birds who had favored the sprouted grains and those who favored the traditional ground feed, but the majority of the chickens would immediately favor the sprouted grains when feeding of grain and ground feed happened simultaneously. From observation, it appeared that a few factors played a role in the chickens eating the hazelnuts. First, by mixing, we softened and moistened the hazelnuts somewhat prior to feeding. This made the hazelnuts more palatable to the chickens who had previously been ignoring them. Second, the hazelnuts became coated in the water vinegar mix that the chickens had already identified as feed. This is in a case tricking the chickens into believing that they were eating sprouted grains. Third, changing the feeding method and timing was associated with a behavioral switch to more aggressive foraging. By feeding a more forage-based feed prior to the regular ground feed, the birds started each day being encouraged to scratch and peck rather than eating at the feeders. An interesting observation that is hard to connect to feed but is nonetheless worth noting was that the group fed only cornmeal and no soy tended to range to the full extent of their paddock, while the group fed only 50% of the soy and the control groups ranged very little as a whole. Some individuals would range the whole paddock, but it appeared that it was only a dozen or so birds from each flock engaging in this behavior each day versus the inverse in the corn group. It's hard to quantify exactly what percentage of hazelnuts fed in this way were ultimately eaten by the chickens. By spreading, much less of the feed is visible during observation and thus can't be easily accounted for. Where spreading happened in open ground or in feed trays, a majority of the hazelnuts appeared to be eaten, except for the excessively large pieces. And a major issue with feeding hazelnuts mixed in this way is that sprouted grains only represent a portion of their diet. By volume, it would be incredibly difficult to mix all of the hazelnuts needed for a full replacement ration in a large flock. For reference, the sprouted grain ration for each group, which was roughly 200 birds, included only one full 5-gallon bucket per day. The traditional ground feed needs was well over 4 buckets per day as the birds approached full size. So a radical change in feed infrastructure would need to happen with our operation to support a larger shift to sprouted grains and hazelnuts that would be difficult for us to justify. The mixing process was necessarily an additional daily chore. Due to our system for sprouting grains being designed for grains only, we didn't have the capacity to soak larger mixed batches and thus had to do so each morning for that day's feed. The labor requirement for this additional mixing and handling was difficult to justify as it added another 10 to 15 minutes of additional time each morning to the general feeding chores for only 400 chickens. Over the course of the flock, this adds upwards of 8 hours in labor, a number that would more than triple if done to feed the full 1,500 bird flock. For the rest of the flock duration, we continued to employ a variety of the feeding techniques described above to ensure maximum exposure to hazelnut feed. There were a handful of discussions regarding other methods that could be employed to encourage feeding, but none were deemed to be worth testing. The economic reality of feeding chickens hazelnuts felt compelling enough on its own to discourage future experimentation. Due to a material ordering error, our poultry live scale was not fully operational throughout the duration of the flock. We believed we had ordered a unit that included a battery system, as our coops do not have any grid power at them, but we discovered that the battery system needed to be ordered separately. After talking with our original supplier and the manufacturer, we learned that the factory battery system would need to be ordered from Germany, and delivery would likely not be available until after the flock had finished up, due to COVID shipping delays. We were able to set up a temporary system that allowed us to collect some data, but we had significant issues with power failures and unusable data. The data we were able to collect showed an average weight of 3.5 pounds for the group fed no soy at day 60. This was based on 1,145 discrete weigh-ins, indicating that each bird was weighed multiple times throughout the collection period. The flock fed 50% of the soy ration had an average weight of 3.7 pounds on day 61. This group registered only 208 discrete weigh-ins. The placement of the scale within the coop space appeared to have a significant impact on the number of collected weights during any given period. The control group had an average weight of 4.79 pounds on day 63 and 64 from 890 discrete weigh-ins, and a slightly higher average of 4.825 pounds on day 65 from 562 discrete weigh-ins. Due to the nature of the scale, it could only record results from one group in any 24-hour period. All previous and future data was determined to be unreliable as the scale either failed to collect sufficient data, in most cases only taking a single reading and then stopping recording, or power failures causing a loss of stored data. We believed that these issues would not be present in a facility with constant grid power. We were also unable to collect final weights for each group post-processing, as a communication error meant none of the carcasses were kept separate, but rather were mixed together. While we sell our chickens in a CSA model where individual weights are not a concern, we recognize that many producers rely on strong carcass weights to meet revenue goals. The best we were able to offer is clear data showing that the no soy and partial soy fed chickens were substantially smaller of frame between the 8 and 9 week marks. Some variation is common with the Freedom Ranger breed, but the differences observed in this project were much greater than previous flock variation. Confirm the availability of needed inputs at the scale required if sourcing from an off-farm supplier. If we had known how difficult it would ultimately be to source pressed hazelnut meal, we would have explored the potential of including other protein sources in our trial groups. With this knowledge, we can tentatively recommend that farmers not plan on being able to source pressed hazelnut meal for livestock feed in the near future. If looking to transition to alternative feed sources to meet specific goals like soy-free, continue to offer known successful feed types while experimenting. This allows you to make personal observations about how well your animals are taking to the new feed source without risking a significant loss of quality of slaughter weights. We suggest using a 50-50 rule to determine if the new feed type will be successful. If given the free choice, if 50% of the animals choose the new feed type, you will not have a negative result from rejection. This isn't to say that the new feed type will perform equally, but success will not be hampered by selection. Live weight poultry scales are a worthwhile investment for farmers hoping to project carcass yield in a large flock. Previously, we had employed a hand scale to collect weights once a week. This yielded results from only 10 to 20 birds per week, and ultimately was not a hugely helpful tool in predicting final carcass weights. The live scale allowed for the collection of weights from many more individuals on a daily basis, which over time would allow us to make much more informed decisions about the ideal processing time. A quarter-pound difference at processing time in a 1,500 bird flock can pay for a quality live scale and help increase annual profits by roughly $2,000 per flock. Pre-mixed bulk feed is worth investing in at any scale. The time required to mix feeds on a daily or weekly basis is substantially more valuable than the mixing fee paid to the elevator when ordering bulk. The incorporation of all feed elements, including minerals, ensures minimal feed rejection and equal intake between animals. When employing a coop and paddock system, try to supply ample feed 24/7. Our system makes indoor feeding challenging, but from close observation, it appears that this is costing us in small and more aggressive birds. At each morning feeding, there's a significant competition to get access to feeders that is non-existent later in the day. By providing feed overnight in the coops, it would reduce this competition and allow smaller, less aggressive birds to gain weight equally with their larger, more aggressive counterparts. While we learned some valuable lessons from the project, we do not plan on attempting to continue any aspect of this project, as we have determined that there would be no positive impact to our business or the welfare of our animals. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to answer those for you.